Hey everyone. So tonight we dive into something that probably sounds a lot more romantic than it actually was. The question of whether medieval princesses ever actually got to meet their grooms before they said their vows. And I'm not talking about sneaking around in the garden at midnight or staging some elaborate secret rendezvous. I'm talking about real documented meetings, face-to-face encounters between royal women and the men they were being married off to. It's a surprisingly messy question when you start digging into it, because medieval marriage for nobility wasn't about love or getting to know each other. It was politics, economics, land alliances, and power consolidated through bloodlines. But sometimes, just sometimes, there were actual meetings, and sometimes there weren't. So, before you settle in, maybe do what you do, like the video if you're enjoying this kind of historical gossip. Subscribe if you genuinely want to learn more about these kinds of things. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who tunes into this stuff from around the world. Now let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and figure out whether royal medieval women ever actually laid eyes on their future husbands before the wedding day changed their lives forever. The truth is that medieval royal marriages operated under a system so far removed from modern expectations that it's almost hard to comprehend. Princesses and noblewomen were essentially bargaining chips, pawns in a grand strategic game played by kings and lords who had never even met each other's faces. A princess might be born, and within months or years, her marriage could be arranged to a boy she'd never heard of in a kingdom she couldn't locate on a map. The betrothal was formalized through written agreements, witnessed by important nobles, and sealed with wax and signatures. But in many cases, the actual couple had no say in the matter and had absolutely no chance to meet before they were legally bound to each other. Think about that for a moment. You're a young woman, raised in a castle in what is now France or England or Spain, and suddenly you learn that you're going to marry a prince from Scotland or Germany or Italy. Ypsilon. I don't know what he looks like. You don't know if he's kind or cruel. You don't know if he's sickly or strong. You just know that your entire future, your entire life, has just been decided by men sitting around a table discussing land boundaries and trade agreements and military alliances, and you're expected to be grateful for it. Royal marriages in the medieval world, they were treaties written in human beings. They were political instruments with faces and names and feelings that were supposed to be completely irrelevant to the whole arrangement. So in many cases, the first time a princess ever saw her groom was when she showed up at the altar, dressed in her wedding gown, ready to be married off to a stranger. And that was just how it was done. Eleanor of Aquitaine's story offers a fascinating example of what marriages could look like at the highest levels of medieval nobility. Eleanor was one of the most powerful women of her time, and her marriages were among the most consequential in medieval history. When she was married off to King Louis VII of France as a very young woman, there's actually documentation that they may have met before their wedding. But here's the thing about Eleanor. She came from a wealthy, important family in the South. She had power and influence of her own. She wasn't just being handed off like so many other women were. She had some say, some agency, however limited by the standards of the time. After Louis died, Eleanor remarried to Henry of Anjou. And yes, there was a meeting before this one too. Eleanor actually had a degree of control over these negotiations that was genuinely unusual for the time. She could refuse unsuitable matches. She could demand terms. She could negotiate from a position of strength, because her family's wealth and her own inheritance made her valuable beyond just her potential to produce heirs. But Eleanor was an exception to the rule. Most princesses were not Eleanor of Aquitaine. Most princesses didn't have her wealth, her status, her independence. Most princesses were very young girls being married to men they'd never seen, sent off to foreign courts where they had no friends, no allies, and no power except the power of potentially producing an heir. The difference between Eleanor and every other royal woman of her era was that Eleanor was willing to take control of her own fate. She left Louis. She married again on her own terms, relatively speaking. But that kind of agency was extraordinary. For every Eleanor, there were dozens of princesses who had no choice whatsoever, who had no say, who met their husbands for the very first time at the altar. Now, the interesting thing about medieval royal betrothals is that they happened at all sorts of ages and stages of life. Sometimes a princess would be betrothed to a man as a child, and the marriage wouldn't be consummated until she was older. Sometimes a princess would be betrothed so young that she'd grow up thinking about this distant husband she'd never met, imagining what he might be like, building him up in her mind into something that probably had nothing to do with the actual person. And sometimes, just sometimes, the betrothal would include a pre-wedding visit. Some noble families, especially if they were in neighboring regions or had existing relationships, would arrange for the couple to meet. Not for romantic reasons. Never for romantic reasons. It would be a diplomatic visit, a chance to see if the bride and groom were at least not completely incompatible, a chance to assess the physical health of the woman they were getting, a chance to make sure no major disasters would occur on the wedding night. It was businesslike. It was clinical. It was arranged and formal and supervised by a whole retinue of chaperones and advisors. But it was a meeting, which was more than many royal couples got, and these meetings, when they happened, could actually determine the course of history. If a princess showed up and the groom decided she was completely unacceptable, the marriage could theoretically be called off. If the bride showed signs of illness or infertility or any kind of defect, the whole thing could fall apart. These meetings were testing grounds disguised as courtesy calls. The story of Margaret Beaufort and Edmund Tudor offers a really striking example of what could go wrong when a pre-wedding meeting actually happened. Margaret was married off to Edmund Tudor when she was very young, and because they were in neighboring territories with existing political connections, they actually did meet before their marriage could be consummated. Here's where it gets dark. Edmund apparently decided he wanted to consummate the marriage immediately, and Margaret was so young, so unprepared, that the physical trauma of it resulted in permanent damage to her body. She was barely more than a child when this happened. She would carry the scars of it her entire life. She never had another successful pregnancy after that, even after subsequent marriages to other men. The whole point of a royal marriage was producing heirs, and because of this early, forced consummation, Margaret Beaufort couldn't fulfill her primary duty as a royal woman. She went on to have enormous power and influence through her son Henry VII, becoming one of the most important women in English history, but she paid a price for meeting her groom before the wedding. She paid a devastating, lifelong price. And that's something that often gets left out of the romantic stories about medieval marriages. We like to imagine that pre-wedding meetings were charming encounters, opportunities for couples to get to know each other. But the reality was often much darker. Yes, some couples met before the wedding, but that meeting didn't guarantee anything good. It didn't guarantee kindness or respect or understanding. it could actually make things worse. Catherine of Aragon's situation is interesting because she definitely met her husband before they were married. But it was under completely different circumstances than most royal women experienced. Catherine was sent from Spain to England to marry Prince Arthur. And because she was traveling across Europe for months to get there, and because the English court wanted to verify that she was actually worth all the political and economic investment they were making, there was definitely a meeting. In fact, there was a whole series of meetings and ceremonies and public appearances. Catherine was presented to the English court before the marriage. People got to see her. They got to assess her. She got to see Prince Arthur. But here's the thing. Prince Arthur died not long after they were married, and the whole situation became incredibly complicated politically and personally. Catherine ended up marrying Arthur's brother Henry. And here's where it gets really interesting. Catherine and Henry, they may or may not have met before their marriage. The records are unclear, but they definitely interacted during their time at court together. Whether they actually met in person before Henry became king and decided he wanted to marry his brother's widow, we don't really know for certain. But the point is that Catherine's story shows how even when there was opportunity for meetings, medieval marriage was still fundamentally unpredictable. Nothing was guaranteed. Alliances shifted. People died. Circumstances changed completely. And the women caught in the middle had very little control over any of it. Now, let's talk about the practicalities of medieval travel and communication, because that actually had a huge impact on whether princesses could meet their grooms before the wedding. In the medieval world, travel was slow, really slow. A princess being sent from one kingdom to another might be traveling for months. She'd be on horseback or in a carriage, moving at a pace that modern people would find almost unimaginably slow. The roads were often terrible. Rivers had to be crossed carefully. There were bandits and unpredictable weather, and 1,000 other complications to navigate. If you were being married off to someone in a neighboring kingdom, you might have a chance to meet before the wedding. You might be able to visit his court, or have him visit your court. But if you were being married off to someone very far away, on a completely different continent, the odds of a pre-wedding meeting were incredibly slim. Most princesses who were being married off to create alliances with distant powers, they were getting on ships and traveling for weeks or months without knowing anything about the man they were about to marry. The communication networks didn't exist. Letters traveled slowly, if at all. Messages could be lost. Information could be weeks or months old by the time it arrived. So most princesses knew about their husbands only through hearsay, through descriptions given by ambassadors and nobles, through portraits that may or may not have been accurate. They were marrying essentially blind, walking into a completely unknown situation. And that was just the reality of medieval royal marriages for most women. The marriages between English and French nobility offer some interesting examples, because England and France were relatively close, and there were regular diplomatic missions back and forth. In some cases, when an English princess was betrothed to a French lord or vice versa, there could be actual meetings. Sometimes a princess would be sent to the French court to be educated and prepared for her marriage, and she'd get to spend months or years in the same place as her future husband. This actually happened occasionally with the daughters of kings who wanted to ensure that their daughters would be well received in their future courts. The girls would go ahead, be trained in the ways of the foreign court, learn the language, develop connections, and their husbands-to-be would be able to get to know them. But even in these situations, There wasn't anything like courtship. There wasn't anything like choice. The girl was there because she was being prepared to fulfill her duty. The young man was around because he had political reasons to be interested in the arrangement. But yeah, there could be conversations. There could be dances. There could be a kind of informal getting-to-know-you process happening. It wasn't nothing, but it was also nothing like what we think of as a relationship developing. It was formal, it was supervised, it was controlled. The reality of royal marriages in medieval times is that the personal relationship between the bride and groom was almost entirely irrelevant. What mattered was whether the bride could produce heirs, whether she could adapt to her new court, whether she could maintain the political alliance she represented, whether she could represent her new kingdom with dignity and grace. The character of the groom, the possibility of affection, the chance for actual companionship or love, these things were barely even considerations. And yet, surprisingly often, some of these arranged marriages did work out. Some couples, thrown together by politics and duty, actually grew to care for each other. Some couples had children together, lived their entire lives together, and seemed to develop something that looked at least a little bit like affection or partnership. But that was almost always something that developed over time, after the wedding, as the couple learned to navigate the political and personal complexities of their situation. It wasn't something that started with a pre-wedding meeting or a spark of recognition across a room. It was something that grew out of necessity, out of proximity, out of the mutual effort to make an impossible situation work. Margaret of Anjou's story is particularly interesting because she definitely met her husband before they were married, but it happened because of an unusual set of circumstances. Margaret was sent to England to marry King Henry VI, and because she was a princess in her own right, coming from an important French family, and because she was a woman of significant education and intelligence, there was documentation of her meeting with Henry before they were officially married. In fact, Margaret and Henry's marriage became one of the more interesting royal partnerships of medieval England, though not necessarily in a good way. Margaret was basically incompatible with Henry politically and personally. He was a weak king. She was a strong personality. She wanted to control things. He wanted to avoid conflict. They had a son together, but the marriage became incredibly turbulent. Margaret ended up being involved in the Wars of the Roses. Henry ended up having what we'd now probably diagnose as significant mental health issues. The meeting before the wedding didn't prevent disaster. It didn't create understanding or compatibility. It just gave them a chance to see each other face to face before everything fell apart. And Margaret's story is actually a good example of how even when royal couples met before the wedding, it didn't necessarily improve the situation. Some marriages just weren't compatible, no matter how much opportunity the couple had to get to know each other. Now, Isabella of Valois has one of the most documented pre-wedding situations because she was married to King Richard II of England. And there's actually quite a bit of historical record about what happened. Isabella was very young when she was betrothed to Richard. She was sent to England. She and Richard did meet. There are records of them together at court. There are even accounts of young Isabella apparently charming the court with her youth and vivacity. So they knew each other. They'd spent time together, and yet the marriage was also a product of intense political pressure and necessity. Richard needed the alliance with France. Isabella's family needed the alliance with England. The marriage was still fundamentally political, and after Richard died, Isabella was sent back to France, and her entire position shifted. She was no longer Queen of England. She was a widow in her teenage years, with a completely uncertain future. The fact that she'd met Richard before the wedding didn't change the fundamental reality that she was a bargaining chip, a tool of political alliance, a woman whose entire life was controlled by the men around her and the politics of kingdoms. Meeting him first didn't give her agency or control over her own fate. It just gave her information, knowledge of what the man looked like, what his personality was like, what his court was like. But it didn't change the essential nature of the arrangement. The truth is that for most medieval princesses, whether they met their groom before the wedding or not, the wedding itself was terrifying. It represented a complete upheaval of their life. They were leaving their home, their family, everyone they knew. They were being transported to a foreign court where they didn't know anyone, where they didn't speak the language fluently, even if it was supposed to be the same language, where all the customs and rules were different. They were being expected to produce an heir, which meant entering a marriage bed with a stranger, which for many young women who'd been raised with no knowledge of what that would actually entail, was shocking and frightening. Whether they'd met the groom before or not, whether they had a vague sense of what he looked like or what his personality was like, the reality of medieval royal marriage was fundamentally difficult and frightening. It was an act of duty. It was a sacrifice. It was done because it was what was required of them. And most of the time, their personal feelings about it, whether they'd met the man or not, were not considered particularly important or relevant. When we look back at medieval royal marriages, we see this pattern over and over again. Some princesses met their grooms before the wedding. Many didn't. Some of the marriages worked out reasonably well. Many were absolute disasters. The meetings, when they happened, didn't necessarily predict anything about how the marriage would go. They didn't automatically create understanding or affection. They were diplomatic occasions, formal events, carefully choreographed interactions that were supposed to accomplish specific political goals. Whether those goals were achieved or not often had nothing to do with how the bride and groom actually felt about each other. It had to do with whether the political alliance held, whether there were heirs, whether the bride could survive the transition to her new life, whether the groom could maintain his power and position. The personal satisfaction or happiness of the couple was almost never the priority. And yet, here's what's actually kind of remarkable when you think about it. Despite all of this, despite the complete lack of choice, despite the political and economic nature of these arrangements, some medieval couples did seem to develop genuine affection for each other. Some couples did seem to care about their spouses beyond what was strictly required. Some marriages produced not just heirs, but also what looked like partnership and mutual respect. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but enough that it suggests something interesting about human nature. Even when you're forced into a marriage for entirely political reasons, even when you don't know the person you're marrying, even when you meet them for the first time at the altar, or you never meet them in person at all, something can still develop, connection can still happen, understanding can still grow. It might not be love in the way we think of love now. It might be something more complicated, more practical, more tied to duty and responsibility. But it's something. And maybe that's the real answer to the question of whether medieval princesses met their grooms before the wedding. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. But whether they met or not, what happened next was always unpredictable. Marriage itself was the real gamble. Marriage was when the actual relationship had to be negotiated and built and maintained under enormous pressure and expectation. Meeting beforehand was nice, maybe. Having some sense of who you were going to marry was convenient. But it didn't guarantee anything. The real work of a medieval royal marriage happened after the wedding day, when the bride and groom had to figure out how to live together, how to produce heirs, how to maintain the alliances they represented, all while navigating a completely foreign court, unfamiliar customs, and often a language they didn't fully understand. That was the real challenge. That was the real test. And most medieval princesses, whether they'd met their grooms before the vows or not, walked into that situation with nothing but duty, obligation, and hope. When we step back and look at the broader picture of medieval royal marriage, we see a system that was fundamentally about power, economics, and the continuation of dynasties. Personal relationships, personal feelings, personal preferences, these were almost entirely secondary to the political needs of kingdoms. Princesses were born into a system where their entire lives had already been planned for them, where their value was determined by the alliances they could create through marriage, where their primary duty was to produce heirs and maintain stability in a foreign court. Whether they met their groom before the wedding or not was almost irrelevant to the actual experience of medieval royal marriage. What was relevant was surviving the transition, adapting to a new environment, fulfilling your duty, and hopefully, if you were lucky, developing some kind of working relationship with the man you'd been married off to. Some princesses never even knew their husbands' names until they were told they were betrothed. Some knew years in advance and spent those years terrified about what was coming. Some met their grooms before the wedding and felt instant comfort or attraction. Some met their grooms before the wedding and felt absolute dread. The range of human experience was enormous. But the underlying system, the reality that these were political arrangements, not romantic partnerships, remained constant. Medieval royal marriage was a tool of statecraft. The bride and groom were instruments. Their personal happiness or satisfaction was not the point. The point was creating alliances, producing heirs, maintaining power, and continuing the cycles of hereditary rule that held medieval Europe together. And that's a reality that's difficult for modern people to fully grasp, because we live in a world where marriage is supposed to be about love, about choice, about a personal connection between two people. In medieval times, especially for royal women, marriage was about duty, obligation, and political necessity. Meeting your groom before the wedding was nice if it happened, but it was hardly the most important part of the whole arrangement. The important part was what came after. The important part was actually being married. The important part was making an impossible situation work. And most medieval princesses did that. They adapted. They survived. They fulfilled their duties. They produced heirs or failed to and dealt with the consequences. They lived in foreign courts among people who might be kind or might be cruel. They navigated complex political situations and personal relationships with very little support and very little choice. Some of them seem to have found happiness, or at least contentment. Many of them seem to have been profoundly unhappy. But whether they met their grooms before the wedding or not, whether they had any sense of who they were marrying or walked into it completely blind, they all had to face the same reality. Marriage in the medieval world, especially for royal women, was the hand they were dealt, and they had to learn to play it as best they could.